On the 2nd of August 2009, Top Gear bowed out its 13th series with an absolute cracker of a finale. With Jay Leno as guest star, a gut-busting feature film comprised of Clarkson and May's Sisyphean attempt to put together an advert for the Volkswagen Scirocco that would please Nick and Margaret, the two ad executives in charge of minding their various harebrained efforts, and a gut-wrenching closing film on the Aston Martin V12 Vantage. Not forgetting perhaps the most memorable Cool Wall segment of all time, Series 13 was a classic from start to finish, and it would prove to be a very tough act to follow. And for a while, people wondered if it would be followed. With how emotional Jeremy Clarkson got in the series' closing film, a fair few journalists and fans alike speculated that this was Clarkson's ultimate swan song, a way of announcing his departure from Top Gear, or that due to the choice of the song used being called an ending, this was potentially even the end of Top Gear as a whole. After all, this was only a handful of years removed from Clarkson's osteoarthritis diagnosis in late 2004, and perhaps more relevantly, his repeated injuries in cars such as the slip discs he incurred in the Vauxhall Monaro, the bruising and broken bones he encountered after smashing his Renault Magnum through a brick wall, and the hospitalization he required while thrashing the Nissan GTR around Fuji Speedway. Perhaps the time was nigh for Clarkson to bid his final farewell and retire on the verge of 50 after such a tremendous run on Top Gear. Perhaps it had just been one injury too many, and the time had come to end things on as high a note as possible. Make us laugh one last time, make us feel melancholic, and end it forever as an undisputed televisual legend. Had Top Gear actually ended here with the camera trailing off into the cloudy skies its final ever shot, it would have been an oddly poignant and almost perfect ending. Culturally, it likely would have marked a clear gap between two distinct eras of British culture: the 2000s with all its wacky scripted and non-scripted television events, its obsession with scrap metal and what a pair of budding bride sparks could then build and destroy with it, and the much more restrained 2010s with its overabundance of reality-themed competitions and far less optimistic outlook towards life in the wake of the credit crunch. Had Top Gear actually ended, it would not have been the only long-standing British institution that would have collapsed in the month of August 2009, as the renowned 90s Britpop band Oasis would bitterly break up for what seemed to be forever. And should we remind ourselves what Series 13's opening montage theme was? But in spite of all the ominous signs that may have lay ahead, Top Gear would thankfully be nowhere near its deathbed just yet. Barely a day after that final episode's original broadcast, the Top Gear crew themselves played into the rumours of Top Gear's seemingly inevitable demise, although the planning for its follow-up had already got well underway months in advance. Unless Jeremy Clarkson really had broken his body beyond all repair, Top Gear wasn't going anywhere. It was now BBC Two's biggest asset, and with the channel's third new controller in the 7 years it had been on the air, there were clearly no problems internally, with its latest controller, Janice Hadlow, finding some of Jeremy Clarkson's remarks contestable, but ultimately not malicious. After attending the filming session for Series 13 Episode 5 in July 2009, Hadlow would not be too pleased upon hearing Clarkson's remarks regarding his ongoing scandal with Prime Minister Gordon Brown, during which he referred to Brown as a Berkshire Hunt. However, come 2012, Hadlow had warmed much more positively towards the programme, and argued that it stood atop BBC Two's programming mountain as its own thing, separate from everything else, and that if you then tried to change any of that, you'd be missing the point. With that sort of confidence, Top Gear's production crew certainly weren't anywhere near ready to give up on Top Gear, and nor was BBC Two, who continued to support the team as much as they could, although this support had admittedly started to waver slightly in the past year leading up to this point. The BBC's loyalty to Top Gear wasn't as strong as it had been throughout 2007 or early 2008, owing to a fair few controversies that had transpired in the meantime, but it was still strong enough. Even as late as September 2009, with production now in full swing, the hosts kept getting routinely heckled and pestered by clueless interviewers from media outlets such as The Times over whether or not Top Gear was over, by which point the answer was a resounding no. Over the past 3 years leading up to this point, the BBC had watched the show's growth with rapt anticipation. The fallout from Richard Hammond's near-fatal injury in September 2006 resulted in a best-of compilation racking up a viewing figure of over 2.5 million. And when the programme came back, its audience had virtually doubled overnight from 4 million to over 8 million, unexpectedly dethroning the finale of Celebrity Big Brother 5 in the process as the most-watched programme on the night of the 28th of January 2007. In what would prove to be a stunning upset for Channel 4. Later that year, Top Gear would broadcast its most watched episode ever, one that involved Lewis Hamilton in a reasonably priced car in a TV event that remained BBC Two's most watched programme ever for over 306 straight weeks. That was the night Top Gear triumphantly reached the summit of British TV, everything else below it gazing up in awe. But even though they had reached the top and had now stayed there for over 18 months, there were still bigger mountains yet to climb for the plucky little trio. This was not an ending, but rather a brand new beginning. This is the story of Top Gear's 14th series. In the first of what will build up to hopefully 22 full-length videos plus a few spin-offs along the way, I would like to provide a well-opinionated season review for every single series of Top Gear. Each of these will be around 2 to 3 hours long apiece, cover each episode in a decent amount of detail, go over some of the production and filming details for each episode, and explain some of the dated pop culture references that may have faded into obscurity or otherwise gone completely over some people's heads, as well as provide some contemporary fan reaction dating to when the episodes were first broadcast, and then hopefully provide an enjoyable watching experience for those unfamiliar to Top Gear, as well as those who are more seasoned viewers. If these videos prove to be especially popular, I'll even consider delving into pre-2002 content, and if I exhaust that library, then you'll know what will be coming next. As you might have noticed, I've created a brand new widescreen video background that also isn't quite as intensive to generate as the main one I've been using for many of my other documentaries. As with all future uploads, this video is rendered at 1440p and at 50 frames per second in order to preserve as much of the original detail as possible. At the end of each video, I will then pin the season along my very own call wall, since tier lists are just a little bit blasé for my tastes and it works a lot better within the context of Top Gear. What's important to note is that at the end of the day, although this video is otherwise substantiated by facts and other trivia obtained from reputable sources, my opinion towards the series itself is just that, a purely subjective opinion, and should not be taken at face value. If you want a proper opinion for each of the episodes, the only tried and trusted solution is for you to clear your schedule, put down your phone, and just watch the episodes from start to finish, as I have little doubt your opinions probably differ somewhat from mine. Top Gear, up to the point James May officially left the program in February 2016, is probably one of the least objective modern media franchises out there. A lot of fans can generally agree when a film or episode is worse or better than most, but in the world of Top Gear, one man's trash is another's prized treasure, and all verdicts are equally valid. Unless you think Chris Evans was a good presenter, in which case you're a bit of a moron, or a writer for The Guardian who is hopelessly stuck in their contrarian late 2010s anti-Clarksonian rut. Now, picking which series to start with was quite a challenge in and of itself. I didn't want to start with one of the best series, as I might state an opinion I'll grow to regret later on, but I also didn't want to start with what are often considered to be the worst series, since the purpose of this video is twofold: to provide a series review and to help encourage more people to watch what I personally feel is the best TV show ever made, bar none. I decided in the end perhaps the best series to start with, and this was not a decision aided in any way by BBC Three deciding to re-air it in its original broadcast quality around the time I first had this idea, is Series 14, covering episodes 113 through 119 of 2002 format Top Gear. Series 14 heralded quite possibly the biggest change in Top Gear's 7-year run up to that point. A change from standard definition based on a 625-line standard that was first adopted in the Republic of Ireland in 1961 to a state-of-the-art high-definition broadcast format which raised the number of pixels in each frame from 500,000 to over 2 million. It was the first high-definition series and the only such high-definition series to feature the Chevrolet Lacetti as the actively serving reasonably priced car, in what would prove to be its 7th and final series in that duty. Moreover, 3 of the films shown during the series weren't even filmed in HD, as they were holdovers first intended to air during Series 13 for an 8th episode that ultimately never materialized and were originally shot in standard definition. It was the first series not to feature a single segment on the call wall, and due to a scheduling mishap made during the planning stages of Series 14, the final episode, which was supposed to air during the closing days of 2009, instead aired in January 2010, making it the second of only 5 series to air during 2 different calendar years, the others being Series 7, Series 16, Series 18 and Series 22, and the only series to air during 2 different decades. Of the Series 7 episodes, only one of them, Episode 7, was actually broadcast at Top Gear's usual time slot of 8 PM, with the other 6 shown at 9 PM, 8:30 PM, and 7:45 PM in the case of the Bolivia special. It was one of the 6 series that would follow it that was simultaneously broadcast on 2 different channels, BBC 2 in standard definition and BBC HD in high definition. It was also one of only 5 series to not feature a pre-season montage of what to expect during the course of the series, the others being Series 3, Series 9, Series 15 and Series 17. This makes Series 14 quite a rare series in terms of how it was configured. There are of course further oddities in the sense that its special, the Bolivia special, wasn't the final episode, nor did it precede the rest of the series, with only the US and Botswana specials before it holding the same distinction. It was also the third to last time the cars used for the special were bought locally as opposed to being shipped over from the UK, the only other times after this being the Middle East special and the Burma special. Rain would prove to be a major factor throughout Series 14, as it was filmed during one of the UK's wettest ever periods since records began in 1914, to which extent the middle of November 2009 still holds some rainfall records which continue to stand as of late 2024, as of the recording of this video. The effect of this non-stop rain meant of the 9 power laps conducted for that series, 8 of them occurred in damp to very wet conditions. What's also odd is that compared to earlier and later series, Series 14 of Top Gear is strangely scant in terms of behind-the-scenes footage that's been publicly released. Now, initially these were hosted on the video section of the official Top Gear website, which, when the BBC decided to selfishly purge almost all of its legacy Top Gear web content in one long, spiteful act of deletion, these clips bit the dust and became lost media. Thankfully for us, the American Series 14 DVD release comes to our rescue, and preserves most of these behind-the-scenes goodies you simply cannot get anywhere else. Many of these had been previously uploaded to TopGear.com during the winter of 2009, albeit at a much higher bitrate for the trade-off of being stretched to the incorrect frame rate of 30 FPS. Sadly, not all of these clips made the cut, with Clarkson's campaign for the best car manufacturer, James May explaining his crotchal tingling sensation, and 2 clips which talked about guns, all being kept off the disc for likely self-explanatory reasons for the most part. A further omission included a backstage performance from 7th episode guest star C6 Steve. So when it comes to talking about scenes that no longer exist, I'll try to best reconstruct them using any contextual information that exists, in order to offer as complete a picture as possible. Furthermore, in the Region 2 power release of the Challenges Volume 3, a longer 15-minute version of the 2009 Top Gear Awards was included, with the version that made it to broadcast being only 9 minutes long for time constraint reasons. But other than those, along with a few other scenes that were likely uploaded to the official Top Gear website and then wiped later on, that is sadly your lot. There just isn't anywhere near as much behind-the-scenes goodies that exist for Series 11, 12, 13 and 15. With that basic preamble out of the way, we're now going to talk a bit about the series development process. Pre-production for the 14th series of Top Gear started as early as February 2009, during the MPH 08209 World Tour, and before Series 13 was yet to enter full development. As the team toured various countries both on and off the calendar, Jeremy Clarkson would occasionally bring a British-registered BMW X6 to film around a minute or so of footage for a film that was likely originally intended for Series 13, but that's if it was ever intended for TV to begin with. That same month, the Top Gear production crew would ring up Lindstrand Balloons, a world-renowned manufacturer of hot air balloons for specialist purposes, and asked if they could turn a caravan into an airship. This would obviously take some time, but by July it was ready to take to the skies. In the meantime, the team put forth a press release publicly announcing plans for Clarkson, Hammond and May to race a trio of minis through Belfast's newly renovated sewer system in a tribute to one of the Italian job's most iconic scenes, in what was to be filmed by September of that year. However, likely owing to major health and safety concerns, this idea would eventually be nixed and dialed back to just Clarkson showing up in a Renault Sport Twingo. Throughout 2009, there was a very ambitious film plan that never made it past the drawing boards, one that took a lot of time and effort to map out but ultimately wouldn't have worked. Once more, the health and safety risks would have been far too grand, and by the time you'd adequately foolproofed everything to the producer's liking, it would basically have become a comedy skit with how much scripting and jury-rigging would have been required. Basically, Top Gear was to find an old, dilapidated petrol station, and then refurbish and reopen it as their own. This idea would have incorporated a wrecking ball that forced cars that took too long filling up to get out of the way, a jet wash that was far too powerful to be used on cars, an express lane staffed by a Formula 1 crew, and a diesel pump rechristened as Loser Juice that was twice as expensive as petrol and featured Clarkson calling you a loser over loudspeaker if you needed it. If some of that imagery sounds strangely familiar to you, yet you can't for the love of money place where, it's probably because when you were a child growing up at the turn of the first decade, like me, you no doubt saw the remains of this challenge idea in the Big Book of Top Gear 2010, where illustrator Rod Hunt was given the planned film's original premise and told to put together a collage of all these ideas joined into one illustrative disaster piece. And that's not the only thing Hunt would contribute to Top Gear that year. As Series 14's predecessor went through its broadcast cycle, a few other arrangements were made and various other films that did make it past the drawing boards were shot over the early summer of 2009. Of these films, 3 ultimately didn't make the cut, despite 2 of them appearing during that series' opening montage. These were the head-to-head track tests between the Audi R8 and Chevrolet Corvette ZR1, the race between airport vehicles driven by touring car drivers, and a globe-trotting BMW X6 test that was supposed to be simple and cheap. At the time, the first 2 of these films were presumed cancelled by the extant Top Gear fan community at Final Gear, as it would not have marked the first time a film was outrightly scrapped from the series altogether despite prior promotion. In previous years, films would often be put back a series or 2 if scheduling conflicts came up, but this time around anything that didn't make it to TV was likely not going to air at all, given a recent dilemma the team were facing, whether or not Top Gear was going to go HD. With widescreen now having become the standard, one that Jeremy Clarkson was keen to adopt from as early as possible in order to future-proof any programming he produced, the BBC decided its next forte would therefore be high-definition broadcasting, and in 2005 commissioned Bleak House, a 15-part serial starring Gillian Anderson based on the Charles Dickens novel of the same name. In the year that followed, with HD adoption soaring largely thanks to the format war Sony was on the verge of winning with their Blu-ray discs, the BBC decided to invest in some high-definition cameras and, along with some further experiments such as David Attenborough's Planet Earth, began preemptively preparing for a long-term transition to HD for all of its programming. Switching to HD was important because the earlier the Top Gear made this switch, the more future-proof the series would be in terms of subsequent broadcast. Those series of significant historical importance are usually never taken off TV anyway, but are instead typically stretched or given other odd tweaks. Going HD maximised the rebroadcast potential for Top Gear going forward. Crucially, given that the US had actually got the jump over much of the world in terms of switching to HD, this made the programme much more appealing to foreign broadcasters, including the US. In July 2007, BBC HD would air the Top Gear Polar Special alongside regular definition transmission on BBC Two, with 4.72 million people recorded as having tuned in. It was then almost certainly re-aired thereafter due to the lack of HD programming in general by that point, although we have little to no record of this, since that channel was only being ran in a trial capacity until its official launch on the 1st of December 2007. Because of this, it's possible that as many as 1 million or more viewers tuned in via HD but simply weren't counted, though that once again does make the assumption that a sample size equivalent to 0.08% of the British population is in any way accurate, although sadly it's all we have to go off of. Development towards high-definition broadcasting would continue for much of 2008 into 2009 as the BBC made its picture clearer and extended the channel's broadcasting hours to 9, the maximum the BBC Trust were willing to allocate it, as well as implementing a bucket load of DRM in the name of preventing piracy, which, as you can plainly see from the fact I'm showing clips of BBC HD's inaugural high-definition broadcasts of Top Gear, were about as airtight as an old clapped-out rover filled with water, and drew only derision from the community who were none too pleased with measures they felt were unnecessarily harsh towards fair-paying customers. By April 2009, BBC iPlayer would introduce high-definition streaming for the very first time, meaning you could watch HD programs on your computer, and by the beginning of May it was made available for those using Virgin's V+ Digibox, which had actually supported HD broadcasting since its 2005 introduction under TeleWest, by then a long-defunct provider of digital TV that had merged with the fledgling NTL before rebranding its entire outfit under Richard Branson's vast umbrella. By June of 2009, while the development team tried to draw its critics' attentions elsewhere, the demand for Top Gear to make the switch to high definition had grown deafening, and they could ignore it no longer. For the company's July 2009 blog post, Danielle Nagler would ask those who had brought up Top Gear in previous posts why they felt the program was a suitable candidate for HD transmission, with comments unanimously in support of the idea and providing a myriad of reasons. Finally, in September 2009, there was some good news, and it didn't yet involve a Dacia Sandero. On the BBC HD blog, Nagler would announce what many had been anticipating for months, that Top Gear's next series was to be shot in high definition, with broadcast camera rental company Elektra hooking the production team up with some brand new Sony PDW F800s, a high-definition Cinealta camcorder that had only just come out in the early summer of 2009. These would replace the aging Betacam-based Sony DVW790s that had been around since Top Gear first returned to the airways in the early 2000s, and whose antiquated picture quality was now somewhat holding the program back, given how much more brilliant Series 12's Vietnam special could have looked in high definition, for instance. It's not known for sure, but it seems that the Top Gear crew were likely aware behind the scenes that there were plans to film in HD, as rather than film throughout the summer as they traditionally do, Top Gear took a small break and only started filming properly in September, which was unusually late in the year for a winter series, given that Series 10, for instance, had already entered full production by June 2007, with both the original Greatest Driving Road film and The Hunt for the Oldest Car with a Modern Control System in the can by the end of that month. Perhaps to the series' detriment, what this meant was Top Gear wouldn't have a lot of time to film abroad as it normally would, nor would it have a lot of money to do so, with 14 of the series' 16 non-reasonably priced car films shot entirely within the United Kingdom. To offer some contrast, Series 13, in spite of the programme's budget cuts, shot only 13 of its 18 films entirely within the UK. Series 10 through 12, which were each filmed pre-budget cuts, featured 64 films, out of which only 48 were shot in the UK. There is, however, one film in Series 14 that's a real oddity, and that's the simple BMW X6 road test that ended up traversing the entire world. Filming for this segment evidently had to begin in February 2009 before even most of Series 13's photography had got underway, because the locations of Australia and Hong Kong line up perfectly with the MPH 08209 World Tour dates. Speaking of World Tours, the second World Tour to be branded as Top Gear Live as opposed to MPH would begin that November, meaning any extra time the team could have used to film additional segments was cut drastically short, with only 2 films shot outside Dunsfold that were recorded beyond that point. Put bluntly, Series 14 gave the team a mere 60 days to record over 5 hours worth of television. It was a tall ask, but if anyone could do it, it was the Top Gear team. For the next introductory bit, we'll be talking about each of the hosts, the age they were when filming commenced, any health issues they might have been experiencing, or any personal issues that boiled over into the news cycle, among other things. We'll start with Jeremy Clarkson. Now heading into the end of his 40s, having turned 49 during filming for the previous series, many thought Clarkson was about to hang up his keys once and for all. These fears were quickly assuaged after some playful banter on behalf of the Top Gear transmission blog, but it was perhaps the first time in the years following his late 2004 diagnosis that people, fans and non-fans alike, clamoured over the question of just how long Clarkson had left on Top Gear. Over the previous year, his words and actions have become more and more abrasive and controversial, continually falling under public scrutiny, and made headlines more and more often. The fallout towards his one-eyed Scottish idiot outburst, for instance, over Prime Minister Gordon Brown in February 2009, had now persisted for months, and only reignited during the broadcast of Series 13 thanks to Clarkson lambasting the PM a further time, landing him in even further trouble. In the overall chronology of Jeremy Clarkson's life, 2009 seems to be a bit of a dark year for him, as he notably regressed once more into his smoking habit, this time not caring whether or not the news cameras saw him, as this rather infamous shot from the Romanian road trip would indicate. Following up from a tremendous slap to the face with a pie 4 years earlier, September 2009 would see the group known as Climate Rush deposit some bags of manure outside Jeremy Clarkson's door, accusing him of landing everyone in the metaphorical dung heap by the time its most influential, though nonetheless equally irrelevant member is set to turn 49 unless he changed his ways and repented. Because in a world where pop stars use private jets as public transport, a man who drives fast cars for 20 hours a year is naturally going to be public enemy number 1. However, all this cynicism didn't necessarily mean that Clarkson wasn't somewhat filled with regret. Speaking with BBC News reporter Fiona Pryor in October 2009, Clarkson would reflect somewhat pessimistically on his ability to court controversy, criticising himself as though his mouth and brain weren't connected to one another. Perhaps no better example of this surfaced in The Times on the 9th of October that year, where Clarkson said this. Obviously, I won't be commenting directly on the statement Clarkson issued since it's hardly relevant to the topic at hand, but I do find it rather astonishing that sentiments such as these have existed for anywhere near as long as they have, and certainly didn't pop up out of nowhere to a generation whose favourite word appears to be woke. Among various other topics, Pryor questioned Clarkson on the future of Top Gear, as well as his thoughts towards the then recent Strictly Come Dancing ageism scandal and pay cuts within the BBC, stating that Top Gear's enduring success after 13 series meant that he was in no rush to call it a day, given that it remained BBC Two's most watched programme and otherwise continued to outperform everything else on the network. A month later, Clarkson would also offer his thoughts towards online torrenting, and they weren't nice ones to say the least, though one does wonder if he'd had words put in his mouth by certain members of the show's production team. Speaking candidly for a moment, in regards to the illicit online distribution of Top Gear, Clarkson would have had a point here if the worldwide distribution model for Top Gear wasn't so abysmally poor for so many years. It took until 2013 before BBC America was finally airing every series from Series 2 onwards, and even then they were still extensively cut and edited for broadcast. Even in the UK, as I've pointed out many times, the home video distribution model for Top Gear, especially when compared against certain other BBC properties such as Doctor Who for instance, was notoriously poor, with 2009 marking the first time any of its first 13 series had been made publicly available on DVD. Even then, the resultant Series 10 DVD cut out 10 whole minutes from every single episode, which over the course of 10 episodes works out to nearly 2 hours of footage. Simply because the BBC were micromanaging and didn't want to fork out the extra few pennies that an extra disc would have necessitated. Series 11 would make further needless cuts such as the Top Gear stuntman films, and when it came to Series 12, the BBC made the radical, revolutionary and unprecedented decision to not release it in the UK at all. Torrenting bypassed all this by giving viewers the episodes exactly as they aired, and in the quality that equalled, if not better, than what was put on home video, provided you knew where to look. It's what allowed me to make these videos and analyses in the first place, because if it was up to the BBC to supply the same footage, I basically wouldn't be able to talk about anything from before Series 9, and the last 5 series would be hopelessly stuck in standard definition. Ultimately, this never mattered in the end. A decade later, Jeremy Clarkson would finally rebuke his earlier words and recognise that the community that had built itself around Top Gear were never an enemy, and were in fact a very large part as to why Top Gear became as big as it did. At the end of October, one of the many monthly hit pieces against Top Gear would surface in the Daily Mail, where one of Scotland's top police officers criticised Clarkson and claimed he was encouraging drivers to speed as though it were a positive macho thing, with the usual tired and nonsensical references to Hammond's accident, the drinking of gin during the Polar Special, and the Stig. And if you're going to include the latter, then you might as well chuck in F1 along with any other discipline of motorsport. Chuck in video games too while you're at it. It's not a particularly relevant article in the bigger picture, but it is always important to remind people just how much Top Gear upset the televisual elitists of the era, who were looking to blame the programme for anything and everything they could pin on it. Most of this criticism typically came from the very classes the three hosts represented, who couldn't understand why a programme like Top Gear, a show where hundreds of thousands of pounds of machinery was trashed and thrashed every single week, appealed so well to a downtrodden working class who realistically couldn't afford any of it, especially in the middle of a worldwide recession. Put simply, it was televisual turkey twizzlers at a time many channel controllers wanted organic farm-raised fillets on their schedule. They wanted programming that focused less on human excess and more towards supposedly refined, thought-provoking content that aligned with their own cultural sensibilities, usually from the temple of gore. These critics were eager to promote shows that highlighted social issues and injustices that they believed was more worthy of airtime, but Top Gear's renewed success was a stark and harsh reminder that mass appeal didn't always necessarily correlate with what the cultural elite deemed more valuable or important. Moving on, the entirety of Richard Hammond's 2009 seemed to be one massive world-spanning Final Destination movie, the Grim Reaper seemingly angered after having been cheated out of the show's beloved hamster yet again. In January, he'd fall off his horse in such a way that he effectively impaled himself on his own car keys, wrenching one of his pelvic joints. In February, during the Top Gear live shows held in Auckland, New Zealand, the helicopter himself and Jeremy Clarkson were flying in was forced into an emergency landing after striking a seagull on takeoff. In August, he'd wreck his Morgan in a manner even Clarkson would have been proud of, getting himself into a scary 4-car pileup which Hamster found himself at the back of. And finally, in November, as the studio films for Series 14 were being put together, he'd go for a woodland run, only to tear the ligaments in his ankles, which impacted filming of the first few episodes but was carefully hidden by the production team so that if you didn't know any better, you'd never have noticed. In fact, if you watch the Romanian road trip episode in full, you will notice during the studio segments, Richard Hammond does not take a single step throughout the entire episode. He stands completely still, other than to twist on his leg, and is not shown getting into nor out of the chairs for the news segment. A week later, he takes a bit of a step or two every once in a while, but again, for 95% of the episode, he's either stood still, sat in a chair, or at the very end, leaning against the electric car they built. And for those wondering if I'm employing a little bit of the old hyperbole here, on the episode of the Paul O'Grady show that was filmed and aired a mere 8 days before the first studio sessions for Top Gear's 14th series took place, Hammond was seen limping around on crutches. Days later at the Earl's Court shows for the opening leg of the 2009 Top Gear Live tour, Hammond walks slowly and with a pronounced gait, with the occasional limp still persisting. Furthermore, during the pre-season warm-ups a couple days after that, you can see Hammond is still clearly in some sort of pain, as he limps before leaning against the Aston Martin DBS they had on the set. Luckily, by the time the TV cameras were rolling, most of the apparent pain had subsided. In the midst of spending the majority of 2009 nursing various injuries, Richard Hammond did manage to get a home video of his own filmed. Hammond would put his name to Top Gear Uncovered, the first of 6 consecutive yearly home video releases released under the Top Gear brand, and went directly head-to-head against Jeremy Clarkson's Duel. Unsurprisingly, the latter easily won out in the battle of sales, peaking at number 10 on the video sales chart during the final week of the decade, up against Uncovered's 19, which rather dramatically fell to 81 in the first week of 2010, and otherwise took a lot longer to get going in the first place. On September 9, 2009, as part of his ongoing contract with British supermarket chain Morrison's, Hammond would push a trolley across a rope bridge, Indiana Jones style, in Northern Ireland, and otherwise continue to approach life with a smile, doing great things for the charitable cause he had aligned himself with after battling his own demons in the wake of his accident. For some people, however, this wasn't enough. As you might have predicted, the next couple of minutes are going to be about Stuart Lee and the absolutely ghoulish comments he made in regards to Richard Hammond that went almost entirely ignored by the mainstream media outlets of the era, and the public voices that defended him, such as Guy Halsall. It's something I previously covered in my Richard Hammond documentary, but I'm going to cover it in a bit more detail owing to its relevance towards Series 14's production. As the 2000s drew towards a conclusion, the world of comedy was beginning to change. Sketch shows that had defined the BBC in decades gone by, such as Harry and Paul, Clarkson's favourite comedy series and one that had even lampooned him in its earlier days, were still on the air and continued to build themselves around a more traditional idea of comedy, where you were still allowed to make fun of people's differences equally, instead of only ever punching up and scolding everyone who wasn't as much of a slap-faced snowflake as you. Lee was special, however, as he took personal umbrage towards Top Gear because he once went to the same school as its eventual host Richard Hammond, albeit not in the same year group, making up some random story about saving him from a bullying experience. And thanks to the tribalistic nature of a lot of British TV personalities, once it became known that Hammond's co-host Jeremy Clarkson had made a jab towards the man in number 10, one that Lee had almost certainly helped vote into power, he decided to go on the attack. And after a few months of quiet seething as he put its script together, Lee decided to unleash his infamous Top Gear routine, which in the years since its initial performance has become a rallying cry for the metropolitan middle-class Englishmen that resent being English. As far as I've been able to glean, the routine was comprised of 2 parts, the first of which was a general attack against Jeremy Clarkson and Top Gear as a whole, using his February 2009 Top Gear Live conference at the Rocks in Sydney as his primary source of material. Not the show itself, not another program Clarkson appeared in, not even something that was ever intended for broadcast in the United Kingdom. No, Lee based his material on a live show promo from halfway across the world, purely because he dared to take a shot against the incumbent Prime Minister, no matter how worthy or deserving of criticism their leadership might actually warrant. And the reason I know this video is the primary source of Lee's rant is because while doing research for Series 14 and stumbling upon the original unabridged recording of the Sydney promo, Lee's fans do not, ever, shut up about it, to the point you can reconstruct the gist of Lee's routine purely through the comment section alone. One infamous passage is where Clarkson talks about the studio audience for Top Gear and says this.
Why do they now bring the good-looking girls to the front? Do they?
Wouldn't you? You should see some of the apes that turn up.
Yeah.
So you basically cast about and then you find some fantastically good-looking girls and they miraculously come to the front. One more button left, one more button.
And
This in itself ended up instigating its own controversy at the end of 2009, but Lee's crowd decided to cling on to Clarkson's usage of the word ape, implying that Clarkson was making a racially motivated comment, even though you'd have to be a pseudo-intellectual imbecile at the highest level to ever perceive it that way. And given that admission to Top Gear was free and based on a 50-50 gender split that would have seen the show praised as a beacon of diversity had it happened a decade later, there was absolutely nothing wrong with Clarkson admitting something like that publicly. The second half of Stewart Lee's routine is little more than a heinous, cowardly attack against Richard Hammond, effectively wishing that the worst had happened, all while dragging his family into it on top. And what was Lee's motivation behind all of this? Because he felt the Top Gear hosts were bullies. As was typical of many other critics of the program, Lee declined to cite any specific examples that had offended him in the very limited coverage the newspapers of the era gave this whole controversy, so therefore he found it perfectly agreeable to straight up bully one of its hosts. And it should be important to mention these weren't just jokes. Lee made it clear in his routine that these were his real sentiments towards Richard Hammond, and yet at the time this news hardly caused a stir. Compare that to 13 years later when a mere 40 words in one of Jeremy Clarkson's Sunday Times articles spawned a moral outrage of widespread condemnation by merely doing the exact same thing Stewart Lee had built his entire career on. And one wonders exactly where each of those media hypocrites were when Richard Hammond was the butt of something far more directly abusive and graphic. This is where Guy Halsall comes in. 2 years after Series 14's broadcast and in the days following Jeremy Clarkson's appearance on The One Show, where he suggested the union workers protesting their pay should be shot, Halsall had quite a few things to say about it. The reason I've chosen to highlight him over anyone else is that his very lengthy, very whiny blog post provides a rare glimpse into not only the sort of person that finds Stewart Lee funny, but the sort of insufferable, stuck-up authority figure that people like Halsall inherently are. In Guy's blog post, where he voraciously defends Lee's routine and makes frequent sycophantic references to it, as though Lee's actually going to read it, he screeds the typical neo-segregationalist claptrap his crowd predictably promotes without a shred of irony. He also compares himself favourably against the 3 million people who were members of a Facebook group who felt Jeremy Clarkson should be Prime Minister, in the usual way that an out-of-touch, middle-class social commentator with an overinflated sense of self-importance like him would remark. Among various other notably brainless outbursts Halsall makes, such as implying that the USSR wasn't a left-wing government and that the genocides, massacres, artistic repression, senseless cultural destruction, a government that became so unliked that its own soldiers helped to depose it, and the bureaucratic incompetence which resulted in the worst nuclear disaster in history, all weren't valid enough reasons to discourage the so-called free thinkers of the era from being skeptical over socialism. Halsall falsely argues that it was the public sector that largely helped Hammond out during the immediate fallout of his accident. In reality, although essentially freelancers for the NHS, the air ambulance service is in fact entirely privately funded, and it was Hammond's accident that resulted in the air ambulance charity, the MAAC, receiving £250,000 worth of public donations, which I think, I'm fair in saying, is a damn sight more of a contribution to the UK's public sector than Stewart Lee or Guy Halsall have ever contributed in their entire lives. Nonetheless, Halsall then sees it fit, as Stewart Lee did, to attack Hammond and his publishers, accusing them of pocketing all the profits from the sale of his autobiography instead of donating them to charitable causes. Now, in my many hours of research, I've not been able to unequivocally establish whether or not what they said was true or just another slanderous lie. But in the argument as to whether or not Richard Hammond gave any of his own money to charity, I feel we're forgetting one crucial thing here, something I think that's rather important in the overall argument and brings it to a final and decisive conclusion. Richard Hammond is a man that crashed a jet car at over 300 miles per hour. 300 miles per hour. To even so much as get behind the wheel of what was essentially scaffolding with a jet engine on the back of it requires a level of bravery that spineless cowards like Lee and Halsall would never ever be able to muster. You have to have something majorly, psychopathically wrong with you if you think whether or not he donated any of his own money was an appropriate question to ask under any circumstances. To survive something like that and return to your job seemingly unscathed, you should be allowed to be as stingy, as penny-pinching, and as self-serving as you want for as long as you continue to live. Because Hammond cheated death. and in doing so he gave the air ambulance service an extra air ambulance they otherwise would never have had, which is certainly one more than Leo Halsall can ever attest to. The year 2009 would prove to be a thoroughly stacked year for James May and arguably served as his breakout year from underneath the imposing shadow of Top Gear. After winning Heat Magazine's Weird Crush of the Year for 2007, instigating a Top Gear threepeat, his career had notably been on the rise for a good number of years at this point, particularly after the founding of the James May Board, a forum dedicated for his rapidly growing and dedicated fanbase. But it was 2009 when May's career arguably took off. In addition to another series of wine tasting with Oz Clarke and a pair of space-themed specials intended to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the NASA lunar landings, 2009 perhaps most notably featured James May's biggest independent project yet, James May's Toy Stories. Though this will be much more elaborated upon in the documentary dedicated towards him, the series saw May build various mega constructions out of everyday toys, including perhaps most infamously of all, a life-sized Lego house alongside the world's longest scale electric track, the latter setting a record that is very unlikely to be beaten anytime soon owing to the circumstances of its construction. It's also worth mentioning that May likewise released his own home video in November of 2009 as well, although unlike his two Top Gear co-presenters it had nothing to do with cars but was rather a brain training DVD, a decision that is just so classically James May. Furthermore, in the run-up to the filming of the episodes, May decided to crack out a brand new jumper, described by Top Gear series assistant producer Gavin Whitehead as a striped experiment in the Hadron Collider. Following the Stig's supposed unmasking as Formula One legend Michael Schumacher at the beginning of the previous series, speculation was once again rife over his true identity, with attention continuing to mount towards Ben Collins. He'd last for one more series after this before his very public outburst the following year. Though he'd taken up an increasingly prominent role within the programme's marketing, 2009 was probably the year that the BBC really began to tap into the full potential of the anonymous racing driver, launching a Where's Wally derivative entitled Where's Stig, after originally commissioning artist Rod Hunt for a one-off cartoon illustration that contained references to more than 20 classic Top Gear episodes. The resultant book fastly became a bestseller, selling over 250,000 copies by the end of 2009 and yielding 2 additional sequels in the immediate years that followed. One thing that perhaps might have rocked the Stig's confidence somewhat, speaking fully tongue-in-cheek of course, is that he did not manage to secure a victory in Heat's Weird Crush as his 3 Top Gear co-hosts had managed to do over the previous 3 years, instead placing a mere 4th. All in all, things were starting to get a little rocky for the Top Gear crew and especially the Stig, but it wasn't yet enough to seriously threaten the programme. Those who protested were still a very small, very loud minority of the overall Great British populace, and even the toxic ramblings of a third-rate comedian weren't enough to sway the opinion of the majority of TV license holders over the sort of content they felt they were allowed to enjoy.